Today is August 30th, 2007. We're doing an oral history interview for the archives at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. I'm Charles Lundquist. Our guest today is James Baker, not the former Secretary of State, though, I guess.
Not even the preacher, right?
We're delighted to have you here today. The topic today will be a little bit different than some in that we've been mainly interviewing NASA retirees, but it's important to also understand how the various contractors, Boeing being a main one, entered into the Apollo program and the whole development of space activities here in Huntsville. So I hope we can get that story today.
Flavor, right?
But we'd like to start out by letting you tell a little bit about where you spent your youth, where you got educated, and how you in fact got into the space program.
All right. Yeah, I'm glad to be here today, Charles. And anyway, I am from the small town in eastern Kansas, near Kansas City, Tonganoxie, Kansas. And I went to high school there. I was the second generation in that high school, and my uncle and father all went there. I met my future wife there. I think we started dating when I was a junior in high school, and now we've been married for 51 years. Anyway, I had no real intentions of going to college when I got out of high school. I hadn't really thought about it. I was sort of a farm boy. And quite a few folks in the town and my future wife sort of pressured me to think about going to college. And when I went to work as an accountant for $200 a month, I realized that I was probably going to need a better source of income. So I went to KU and became a Jayhawker there. And I had a scholarship, Hall scholarship. So that helped me get through for a while. And then my wife quit college and put hubby through. She worked the rest of the time, and I waited on through aeronautical engineering. So I graduated in 1959 with a BS in aeronautical engineering.
Just as the space program was really getting started.
Yes. And what I noticed then was there were an awful lot of us engineers that came through that at that time. I think 1,000 of us signed up in KU in engineering, 500 of us made it, and I believe there must have been tens of thousands of people that the GI Bill generated, plus the supply and demand system. And we were the ones that became a lot of us became the contractor engineers that sort of filled in the whole space program. I think we were a pretty major part of it as far as I can tell.
Well, where did you go to work when you finished college?
Okay, I directed my education there as much as I could toward propulsion. So I just went straight after Pratt & Whitney, Florida. And it's sort of interesting here that my starting in life, engineering life, was almost exactly the same as J.R. Thompson's. Like I kid people, I say he and I started out together and I went on to greatness, and I don't know what happened to him. So
I'll ask him next time I see him.
Yeah, it is interesting. I watched his film clip, and actually clear up until he was in the Hick building, our events were almost the same.
That's interesting.
It really was. It's interesting.
Well, tell us about it anyway.
Okay, I'll tell you about Pratt & Whitney. I got there as an aeronautical engineer and went through their training program at first, and they put me in instrumentation, which was sort of a downer for an aeronautical engineer, I thought. But that turned out to be a good education. I was involved in pressure, temperature, and flow on the J-58 program, and that's the jet engine that's on the Blackbird out here at the Space and Rocket Center. And that was a fun program. I'm surprised I can still hear it all after that. I can actually remember standing out in the parking lot, and you could scream at the top of your lungs and couldn't hear yourself. It was so loud around that engine. But anyway, I worked on the J-58 as an instrumentation engineer, and at that point I got involved with the RL-10 program. And so I actually had a chance to work with liquid hydrogen which when I hired in was called Secret Fuel 1. Yeah, they had Secret Fuel 1 and Secret Fuel 2, and that's what it worked on. But anyway, by even knowing the word cryogenic, that helped me throughout my entire career from then on. It gave me a leg up. I left, that's essentially the story on Pratt & Whitney. You want me to move on in time?
Yes, please do.
Okay. I left Pratt & Whitney after 2.5 years and went back to Mama, I guess, as Bear Bryant said, or something. And I went back to Kansas and went to Wichita this time, though, with Boeing. And I was in a wind tunnel group.
What year was that?
That would have been 1961. I left Florida at 80 degrees and arrived in Kansas City at 20 below zero, and a 100-degree drop. So anyway, I hired into the wind tunnel group there, and that was good experience because I had a chance to work with a Mach 3 wind tunnel and a little 9-inch. But you could actually, with the Schlieren system, you can actually see air, and that's a tremendous flow education. So I worked there, and we were on the TFX proposal team, which was the swept wing plane. Anyway, Boeing lost the proposal, or lost the contract or proposal, and so at that time they were just powering down Wichita. So due to the fact that I knew what cryogenics meant, I hired in at the Tulalip test site in Seattle area. It's north of Seattle, and it's a hazardous test site where they rented it from the Indians. And that was my first exposure then to the Apollo program, I guess you'd say. We calibrated the S-4B's continuous capacitance probe. And a fellow from Marshall named Jim Milliken, I don't know if you ever knew him. Did you know Jim? Yeah, he came up with the probe, and we tested it. And that was an interesting experience. I learned a lot again about hydrogen there. And so all this kept pushing me toward cryogenics. And one of the scary events that happened there was my boss and I went out and looked down in this 1,000-gallon tank of hydrogen we had. And it was just solid. It had cryopumped and it just filled up with solid air. It was so scary we just ran. I mean, it could have blown sky high. And anyway, we got around that. Later on, I had a chance to actually be a cryogenic test engineer on liquid fluorine. Now, that had to be the dumbest idea anybody ever came up with, specific impulse or no specific impulse. That stuff is terrible. It's just so bad that the only thing you could do with it was to burn it with carbon coal, and you ended up with carbon tetrafluoride, which I think is rat poison. So it's just bad stuff. Had we had that at the Cape and it had blown up or something, it would have just killed half the state. So I was glad to see that go away. Bad stuff. And so I worked there, and then Boeing started putting pressure on people to come to Huntsville. This would have been in 1964.
That's when they had the big contract.
Big contract.
Started to help with the Apollo program.
Yes. And so I finally succumbed to that, and it was kind of upsetting when I left there. This one fellow told me, he says, well, we have a saying in Seattle that whenever anybody leaves Seattle and goes to Huntsville, the average IQ of both places rise. I wasn't too sure. He says, of course, that didn't apply to me. Yeah, I thought, that's kind of a real dig, isn't it? Yeah. So anyway.
I remember the sign in Seattle that said, will the last person out please turn off the lights?
Isn't that true? I saw that on TV. That actually happened, I think, a little later. Now,
all right.
I'll be to that point shortly here. So anyway.
Well, you were one of a rather large group of people that came from Wichita to Huntsville to work with Boeing.
Yeah, and actually I came all the way from Seattle to Boeing. But yes, they had offered me a job while I was still at Wichita to come down and interview, but they were going to fly us down here in a Ford trimotor, or no, a Lockheed trimotor airplane, Lockheed Electric. I decided I didn't want to ride it now. One of our aero engineers has said that was the most unsafe airplane ever built, so I thought, oh, I don't think I'll fly in that plane. But anyway, back to Wichita, or Huntsville. We moved down, and I thought I was going to the swamps. Had no idea what was here. And I got a surprise when I got here. It was all red dust. The whole town was just being rebuilt in '64, you know, just growing like mad. And we bought a house which was just a string on the ground, like a lot of folks did in '64. And it turned out to be a nice house. And we moved here. Let's see, I had three young children then, all probably 2 years old, whatever. Like most people, almost all the young engineers had lots of children, it seemed like, in those days. And so I went on to the S1C test requirements group and worked there. There were 5,000 engineers, I believe, in the Hick building at that time. Something, or at least Boeing had 5,000 at that time, I think. And so I worked in the S1C test requirements group, did a little bit of this acceptance test or launch language, ATOL, whatever. And then I moved on over into a GSE support group, more or less, in fluid flow, and that was my field. See, I liked that part. I had a chance to work on the cycling problem they had when they first brought up the large LOX pump down at the Cape, where they would just chuff back and forth. I had a chance to work that. That was an interesting program. And so anyway, I worked there in that group for a while, and then as the Apollo program went down, or at least the Sat-5, I moved on over and worked on the Lunar Rover. And that was a fun program because it was the only vehicle I ever worked on where you could understand the whole thing. You know, you could look at that thing and I could say, I know exactly how all that works. So that was different. And
what part of the Lunar Rover were you working on?
Okay, the test requirements again is what I got in. Basically, my whole career in there, what helped me a lot was that I was a pretty fair writer. And that's kind of a rarity among engineers. And so I would get picked up to work in areas like test requirements or whatever. And I wrote, put together the test plan or test requirements for taking the Lunar Rover trainer, or whatever they called it, the one with the Cadillac tires on it. We took it out to Goleta, California, and ran it around a track out there and ran it through all of its paces to see how far the motors would go at the GM test site there, and how steep an incline it could climb. And the navigation system is sort of funny now in the days of GPS. You know exactly where you are. We had one where you had to line it up with a little gnomon up with the sun, and then they would set things based on tables they had on where the sun should have been at that instant. And then we drove the thing all the way around the track. I forget how many kilometers, 10 kilometers or something. And when we got back, it knew where it was within 30 feet. So I thought that was pretty impressive.
Not bad.
In those days, that was impressive. So when the Lunar Rover faded out, that's at that point.
Well, it did its job.
Oh, it's tremendous. Oh, that's another thing about the Lunar Rover. People gripe to me about the fact how much it cost, and I was thinking if you tried to build that camera right there for, and they told you there's any parts that are off the shelf anywhere in the world, it cost $21 million. So anyway, the Lunar Rover was a bargain, even though it did load and it took a lot of time. It was hard to do, and done on time,
And it worked on the moon.
It worked beautifully. Probably wouldn't still work if somebody could get up there and charge the battery. But it was a nice little vehicle. And are there 4 of them up there? I think something like that.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah. And but as that program then ended up, the whole thing started to tumble then, and Boeing at that point in time went from 5,000 in the 60s, or late 60s, to 50 people in Huntsville. So I had a choice to go to Seattle, but the trouble is that was about the time when the thing you were talking about where they said turn out the lights in Seattle. So I chose not to go there, and I went on over to PRC and worked with Jimmy Dollard had it there, and I worked there with him for 5 years, I guess, total, until about 1976.
What organization was that?
It was PRC, what?
Okay, PRC.
PRC, yeah. And they were on South Parkway down there. And anyway, I was working with the systems engineering branch then most of the time. And we did studies, trade studies, for the Skylab first. I worked on the contamination filter that went in there to make sure nothing got outside of it and blocked its vision. And then we moved over and worked on the Space Lab. One of the trade studies there was how big around should the Space Lab B, and it turns out it ought to be as big as you can make it. I mean, that's what you concluded, you know, when you do a trade study. So I worked there until 1976, and then moved over for just a proposal effort on the tethered satellite with Ball Brothers, in which they lost, it turned out. I was just there 6 months, and then happened to run across Rockwell, and that turned out to be a fine job and a fine company to work with. That would have been in 1976, late 76. And my first jobs in there was on the MPT testing down in Stennis, and there again I was writing test requirements. So I got into a lot of test requirements. And so I worked there for quite a few years, ended up working with old Frank Stewart and various folks. And as that faded away there, I moved on over and became the HOS coordinator, and that's where I met Bob Middleton there and the various folks. And I was a HOS coordinator. I worked with Harry McDarris, and was there for quite a few years until the Challenger accident, and of course that shut down the whole thing for quite a while. So I left there, and
what did you do at HOS? What was the coordinator's role there?
The coordinator's role was just to, I guess, make sure the place operated, you know, smoothly, and you kept the records of what was going on. You had to keep the you know, the log. You had to make sure that the right people showed up there for the launches on time. You know, it was just sort of a general helper to the man who ran the whole HOS, which was Bill Butcher, I guess, at that time, out of the systems area. And but that was mostly just of interest. It was just when that Challenger went down, though, I mean, you know, what happened was so terrible was that we all worked there for like, I don't know, 5 days. You just worked and worked and worked, and they kept putting it off and putting it off because of the weather, you know, or whatever. Finally, you just get to the point where you say, "I'll just push the button," you know. Well, when they did push the button, of course, you know what happened. And that was one of the lowest points of my life. I just cried on going home. It was that bad. Of course, she was dead and tired anyway. So after that, I went to work on the technology test bed, and that was out here at Marshall. That was the most fun job, I believe, I ever had. I really enjoyed that. We had, you know, right there with the hardware, you know, and we changed the engine. And in that one, I got to be an analyst. I had that part of the job for quite a while, where we would actually size the, you know, the amount of hydrogen and LOX that ought to be in the tank and what all, and lay out the test profiles. That was a fun work. I really enjoyed that. And almost all of the young NASA engineers I worked with on test bed have gone on to be doing big things. That's a great thing.
It's a nice feeling, isn't it?
It really is. They're all great experience, and allow them to just move on. And so anyway, I worked in the technology test bed, and more or less ended up. And then after that, I had a little bit of work where I did with supporting level 2 effort out of Johnson, and that wasn't to my liking too much, and I had turned 60 and retired. And that's the end of my story, pretty much, Charles.
Oh, what have you done since you retired?
Well, I had 3 trips back, I think, just for short periods of time. One with Boeing. I worked on that, I can't think of the name of these little instrumentation packages they were going to fly and pick up new data, you know. I did that for a while. Worked for Charles Wood. And you remember him, Charlie Wood? Yeah. And then the second time I came back, I worked on let's see, what was it? Oh, the fast track engine. And I got into the pogo pulsing part of that. That was fun, that effort. We were just ready to hit the pogo pulsar at Stennis, and they just called off the program. No, I mean, we were just ready to hit the button. And I never got to see it work. I really wanted to see that thing work. And so that was the second effort. And then I went back and helped with the flow liner problem for a while, and hazard analysis with the USA down here. So I think that was about my last tour.
Are there any observations you'd like to make about the relative role of contractors and the civil service people, and how did that all go from your point of view?
Oh, I don't think it was a problem there. One of the things I would like to say about that, though, is that when they talk about the space program, you hear of the great leaders, you know, like Burner and all. You hear about NASA and you hear about the Boeings and the Lockheeds and all, but you never hear much about the engineers. It's a team. Like I said before, there had to be at least 2,000 or more of us, maybe 20 or 30,000. And we provided a traveling corps of engineering expertise that just went wherever the money and the jobs drove us. And you would go in there and you would work hard, you know, do your job, whatever it happened to be, knowing that your ultimate goal was to get laid off. Now, that's a little different from most of your government folks that worked at NASA, probably. So you would, just to give you an idea of how you took your job, though, in the lunar rover, I made a mental note of this at the time, I think, is that the last week I was there knowing I was going out the door, we worked some free overtime. Now that's dedication.
That is dedication.
But, you know, I mean, that was your job, was that lunar rover. Yeah. So I don't know, it's just a different way of life, I think, for us, in that we continuously faced cutbacks and layoffs, and it went from feast to famine. We were paid well. That's the difference between us and pioneers of old. You know, when we moved around, we were paid pretty well. And in fact, when I first came to Huntsville, after about a year, I even had a maid for a while there at my house to help my wife. So that's hard to beat. We were pretty well paid. And but I don't know of any other problems or anything.
Okay.
It's just,
are there any thoughts you'd like to leave for all the young folks that are now coming on board the space program and propulsion and rocketry and so forth? We got a whole new generation that's got to do some of the same things that you did.
Yeah, they have a little different situation than we had, in that when we started there was nobody older than us that knew anything about what we were doing. Now they you know, they kind of have to feel like they're being watched. I feel sorry for them in that respect, maybe. But on the other hand, they probably have a lot more to start with, a lot better education in what's going on. But I would just have to say, I think you should just try to enjoy what you're doing as much as you possibly can, because it turns out that you produce just as much if you're having fun while you're working as you do if you're just sweating your job and working as hard as you do.
Well, I think you produce more.
I think you do. And
having fun.
Yeah, you certainly live longer. So that would be my recommendation. Just enjoy what you're doing and go on and get on with it. Yeah.
Is there anything we've missed that you'd like to say a word or two about?
No, I think we've pretty well covered my background, Charles. Appreciate it.
Well, you've had a very interesting career, and I sense that you enjoyed it.
Yes, yeah, it was fun, and some of it was better than other. You know, you had your ups and downs. But I guess the one thing I would say about engineering maybe is that of all the professions I can think of, that one is about the only one that is never boring, because you never know what you're doing. If you're a doctor, lawyer, or engine chief, you know, you pretty well know what your job is, but when you're an engineer, you never know what you're doing. So the pressure, you know, it's always of interest to you.
Well, that's a very, very good observation to use as the end of the interview. Thank you very much for being here with us today.
Yeah, thank you.
Enjoyed it.
Good to see you.